Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we're going to take a quick tour of many of the HTML elements that are associated with defining paragraphs and giving semantic meaning to runs of text. So as we're getting started, it's important to remember what I said earlier. Even though your tendency might be to think about the presentation, or in other words, the aesthetics of the web page, you need to think about HTML in terms of semantics. In the case of paragraphs and text, it's the difference of thinking about a particular run of text in a paragraph as being important rather than merely bold or underlined. Do you see the difference there? In one case, I'm thinking about the intent of the run of text. It's important. In the other, I'm thinking about its formatting, its presentation. So therein lies the key difference. The same would be true when we use paragraphs in lesson number 2. You might recall that I had this running dialogue with myself. In fact, let's go ahead and take a look. I have it right here. Let's look at the after folder. And I was specifically talking to myself about this section here. We have a paragraph defined here, and then another paragraph defined right here, where we're including some URLs or IP addresses. And the internal dialogue I had as I was vocalizing it was that I really wanted to put a paragraph kind of to surround all of these things, but yet I needed this vertical spacing so that conventionally it would look correct on a web page. So the way I solved it was to use a paragraph around all the highlighted text you see there, but then to use line breaks because that's the semantic purpose of the line break. So I hope you see the difference there in my way of thinking. I'm looking at the structure of the content merely in terms of vertical spacing versus thinking about things as complete thoughts. And the complete thought argument won out, and that's why I wrapped the paragraph around the entire complete thought and then used the line breaks conventionally to add some spacing in between. You see? So I'm keeping thematically complete ideas together as one unit. All right, so once you get that distinction down, moving from merely presentation onto semantics, it'll become easier and easier to understand the purpose of each of the elements that we look at in the specification. So I want you to recall from the previous videos, the last video, that we were looking at the specification here. We're looking at the version of the specification called HTML5 Edition for Web Authors. It's draft 29, created in March 2012. You might have access to a newer version of it. That's great. The changes will probably be nominal. You can still follow along with what I'm doing, all right? And I encourage you to do that. But if you scroll down on this document, there will be a table of contents, and it's a pretty intense a table of contents with a lot of level of indentation, which is awesome. So the way that I choose to use this is to, in Internet Explorer, hit Control F on my keyboard to open up the Find toolbar, and then I can search, for example, the strong element, and that'll lead to the link that I can right-click and select Open a New Tag, specifically talking about the strong element as we address that in that section of the video. So now I can learn about its definition and see some examples of strong in use. And we'll come back to strong in just a little bit. This was just a quick example. That's how I'm going to use it. I'm going to right-click on each of these individual items in order to learn more about them. And we'll use that as a style of walking through each of the tags that we're going to cover in the next 4, 5, 6 lessons. Okay? So as we get started, please note that I'm merely going to show you what I consider to be the most important elements with respect to paragraphs and giving semantic meaning to runs of text. We've already seen some of these in action from lesson number 2. Some of them are going to be completely new, but in all cases I'm going to show you basically just a subset of all of the possible elements that you could add when defining paragraphs and text within your HTML5 documents. The key takeaway here is that I'm constantly pointing you towards the specification so that we can use the correct element given its intended semantic purpose inside of our document. All right, that's always the key for us. Okay, so let's start with the basics. Remember, you want to use Control F in the find bar, and what we're going to do is look for the word paragraphs. That should lead you to 3.2.5.3 entitled paragraphs. We're going to open that in a new tab, and we just want to understand what is meant when we use the term paragraph. And the definition here is great. That's why I wanted to start here. A paragraph is typically a run of phrase and content that forms a block of text with one or more sentences that discuss a particular topic, as in typography, but can also be used for more general thematic grouping. For instance, an address is also a paragraph, as is a part of a form, a byline, or a stanza in a poem. And we'll see good examples of each of these in just a moment. In fact, let's do this. Let's get rid of that and go back to our table of contents, Control F, the P element, where we'll see some good examples of the paragraph tag in use. All right, so here are some good examples. We can see a traditional paragraph, a couple of sentences kept together like we would read in a book or a magazine article. All right, but then we can also see the use of a paragraph in the creation of a form which we would use to collect information from a user. One paragraph for the name, one paragraph for the address. All right, so we're keeping these collected but thematically separate from each other. Even though they're two fields in the same form, they're still separate fields. All right, the same is true of a poem. Here we have a stanza of a given poem defined by an opening and closing P paragraph tag, and then for each of the individual lines of the poem, we're merely using the line break tag, which we'll get to in just a little bit. So let's hold on to that thought. And then we have some uses and abuses, some examples, and that's very helpful. But structurally, the paragraph tag represents a complete thought, a grouping of sentences or ideas together, but the specification also uses a typography term, a run of phrasing content. It also uses the word thematic, indicating that it can be used beyond a simple textual paragraph, as we saw some examples of just a moment. And we'll see another one of an address here in a little bit. So that brings us to the next idea, which is the line break tag, or the BR element. All right, and I'm going to right click and select open a new tab, and you can see the BR element represents a line break. And let's see, if we need a break in the thought of a given paragraph, and yet the break is merely conventional in nature, then we can use the line break. And a great example of this is a address. We already saw that a paragraph can be used to define an address, but here we see an address created, and by convention we use these BR elements, the line breaks, because that's how we normally visually see an address. Even though it's still one complete thematic thought, we still use these tags to split it up into their own vertical lines, because conventionally that's how we use it. And then below that, it gives us some correct uses and abuses of the BR element. So just to recap, addresses in poetry represent good uses, while using it to separate thematically new thoughts is wrong, because this is the domain of the paragraph element. Now, I just finished saying, don't worry about presentation. However, it's hard to ignore the default formatting of the paragraph tag. We saw it just a moment ago when we were looking at the work that we did in lesson number 2. The default style sheet will give essentially one carriage return for a line break item, and 2 carriage returns for a paragraph tag. But that's in this particular odd instance, that's what the BR is used for. It's used to create a single carriage return, essentially, to give some visual separation. So some of these tags kind of cross between visual and semantic, but that's still the semantic value of it, the purpose of it. Okay, let's move on. Talk about formatting the text itself, giving semantic meaning to the text. And so to do that, let's start with the strong element. And I see it right here, so I'm just going to right click it, but you could type in the strong element into the find and then open it in a new tab. And you can see the strong element represents strong importance for its content, like a warning message, for example. Now, that's in contrast to, if we take a look, let's look at the B element and open that up in its own tab. And the B element represents a span of text text to which attention is being drawn for utilitarian purposes without conveying any extra importance, and with no implication of alternate voice or mood, such as keywords in a document abstract, product names in a review, actionable words in an interactive text-driven software, or an article lead. Now, the only reason why I bring this up is because there's some confusion between strong and the B element with previous versions of HTML. I think there is now a clear semantic difference between the two. With strong, you are indicating that this text has strong importance. With the B element, it's text that you want to draw attention to. Again, in previous versions, it indicated that you wanted the text to be bold, the B tag. However, for that, you should be using strong for that purpose, semantically. Now, the B element merely means that you're pointing out or highlighting those words, but not saying they're important necessarily. And honestly, that's a difficult distinction to make, in my opinion, so I would probably not use the B element as often, preferring other tags that are more suitable for this purpose. But I think the good example of this is where they're using a first paragraph, or the first part of a paragraph, and indicating this as the lead, using a class, which we'll talk about a little bit later, to say that while this text doesn't have importance like a warning message, it does serve a purpose within this paragraph. In this article, it might be, the byline for the headline. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on and talk about some other markup elements. We're going to look at the mark element, and right click and open that in a new tab. And so the mark element, it indicates a run of text highlighted or marked for reference purposes. So a good example is whenever you're presenting search results on a search results page, you can show the occurrences of the word that was being searched for in line, and then using cascading style sheets, you can highlight that using a background color of yellow or something to call that out. Or you could mark a run of text that you want to call attention to, and will explain or describe later in the section. All right, so that's the purpose of mark. Then there's the EM element, and this indicates a word or a phrase of emphasis when you read it, where changing the emphasis changes the meaning of the sentence. This doesn't necessarily indicate the importance of that phrase or that word, just the way that you say it. You might be thinking this is similar to italicizing, however, there's a slight semantic difference between the M and the I element. So let's open up the I element, which traditionally in the past and previous versions of HTML indicated italicizing. In HTML5, however, the I element represents a term that has a special voice or mood, or in some way is offset from the rest of the text. The specification here gives the example of using the I element around a run of text indicating a technical term, and it gives another example. So in this case, look here, here's the technical term. In this other, it gives an example of wrapping it around a dream sequence inside of a short story. Okay, and I bring these up, the EM and the I, because the I element was used in previous versions of HTML for presentational purposes to represent italicized text. But in HTML5, using the I element merely for italicizing some text is a semantic no-no. If you want that to be italicized in the sense that you want it to be read in a different voice or it has some ironic meaning, you would probably choose the EM element instead. All right, so let's go ahead and get rid of these two and move on to the U element. And the U element is used for unarticulated text. It indicates a run of text that you want to call attention to because it's misspelled or it has some strange characters due to its rendering from another language. This is kind of a tough one to describe. I'm only going to call attention to it because its meaning has changed from previous versions of HTML where it was used for presentational purposes. You used to use the U element if you wanted something underlined. In HTML5, again, that is a semantic no-no. You would use purely cascading style sheets for that purpose. Now you use the U element for unarticulated text that you can see for marking stress emphasis. The EM element should be used for marking keywords. The B element or the mark element should be used depending on the context. You can use the cite element, but don't use the U element for any of those. Instead, you can use it for text being a proper name in Chinese text, so a Chinese proper name mark, or labeling the text as being misspelled. All right, so that's its true purpose. All right, let's move on from there and talk about the small element. And a lot of what I'm doing, you'll notice here, is I'm trying to correct maybe changes in previous versions of HTML and what that given element means today in HTML5. So if you haven't ever used HTML in the past, maybe this isn't so important to you, but it would definitely be an eye-opener if you're hearing this for the first time coming from previous versions of HTML. All right, let's talk about the small element. Think small print, like in those car ad commercials, or some text run that's a disclaimer or a caveat or a legal restriction or even a copyright. Just to be clear, just because it uses the word small doesn't mean that it has to be presented using a small font. Again, think of the meaning of the term, not the presentation. That presentation is the job of cascading style sheets. All right? So we're going to compare that to, let's move on to the S element, which used to mean strike through, but it has a new representation today. It's a run of text that's no longer accurate, but it's left in the document for reference purposes. Now, let me see. Yeah, here's a good example at the bottom of this page. You'll see that here's an ad, buy our iced tea and lemonade. And then we have an S tag that wraps around this text. Recommended retail price is $3.99 per bottle. That is no longer valid, but it's left in for reference purposes. Now we're selling it for just $2.99 a bottle. All right. And in the past, you would use this to put a line, horizontal line through the text, but that's not necessarily what it's used for. Again, that's thinking presentationally. We want to think semantically that this is information that's no longer valid, but we're leaving in for reference purposes. Okay. So let's contrast the S element to the DEL element, and you can see that moves way deeper in our outline, our table of contents, to something called edits, and that is the fundamental difference between using S for strike through and DEL for strike through. DEL indicates that the content is marked for removal. So the example they provide is to mark a run of text in a to-do list as complete. So you might mark that with DEL, the DEL element, and then later on style that text with a strike through. So if you've ever used like an online to-do list, like 37 Signals applications, typically like Backpack or Basecamp, they have to-do lists, and when you put a check mark in one of the check boxes, it'll put a line through. That would be a good example of the use of the DEL keyword that could then, that presentationally means like you finished that item, and then you could use CSS to add a strike through or a horizontal line through that entire line that you've completed. All right, so that's the difference between the S and the DEL elements. And like I said a moment ago, the DEL element really belongs in a separate section of the specification called editing, like we saw back here. It's used for web applications and content management systems. However, I added here because of its similarity to the S element, like I said a moment ago. All right, moving on, let's talk about the cite element, C-I-T-E. And so if you're working on technical papers or a research paper, you might want to use the cite element. Let's open that up in a new tab. And so the cite element represents the title of a work, a book, a paper, an essay, a poem, a score, and so on. this can be a work that's being quoted or referenced in detail. So you use this to identify the title of a work that's being quoted, perhaps in a nearby block quote section. And you can see some examples of this, I believe, here. Well, they don't have a block quote here. But you can see how we're citing specific books, comics, tracks from albums, and so on. Here we are citing a Wikipedia article, all right? So it needs to be used in conjunction with perhaps a block quote. So let's look at that. Let's close that up. And we're going to see a more complete example here. And so the block quote is a grouping element used for quotations from another source. Let's scroll down to find the one that has a good cite in it. There we go. So you would then often cite the source inside of the block quote using the cite element that we just looked at a moment ago. The cite can also be used outside of the block quote to call the user's attention to the block quote from, say, a paragraph. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Take a look at this example. Here we're citing Sonnet 130 and then using the block quote element with a cite property or attribute set to where we pulled this from originally, a web page on some fictitious example, all right, where we have then the actual sonnet being quoted in the block quote, all right? And so again, here's another example of a block quote. Then in the caption of that block quote, we're citing the specific articles and citing the magazine or the professional publication where it was originally published. All right, so just keep in mind that block quote and cite sometimes work together and are used whenever you need to reference in a more professional context other websites, documents, books, music, whatever the case might be from around the world. Okay. All right, and then let's move on to the code element. And that kind of takes us in a whole other direction. And you can see the code element represents a fragment of computer code. And so a good example of this as we scroll down is this section here where we are defining a run of text as code, specifically code, and we're going to use the class element to say that this is Pascal programming language. Now this is optional and there is nothing here that would prevent us from putting any language, even something that's not really a programming language. This is probably more for presentational purposes to format this different than, say, C# or C++ or Visual Basic Code. Okay, but at any rate, we're using this this element, code element, again around a run of text to indicate its semantic meaning, that this is code and it should be interpreted as such for presentation purposes. There's also this pre-tag, which we're going to ignore mostly for now. It's used to essentially maintain the indentation levels, for example, the amount of individual spaces, the fact that this is returned, because otherwise HTML would not pay any attention to white space, carriage returns, and things of that nature. But we're not going to look into that any further in this lesson, at least. Okay? Okay, so let's now take a break and move on from there. And I want to talk about the anchor tag. It's a big deal in web development, and so it's important that you know how it works because it has quite a few options. You use the anchor tag to create hyperlinks within your document, and we've used hyperlinks all along, even in this lesson where we see these are all hyperlinks. As I hover my mouse cursor over, notice that the URLs are changing near the bottom left-hand corner of my web browser. All right, and you know how hyperlinks work. You've used them probably to get to this very video or web page where you're watching this video. There's a whole section of the specification that are devoted to defining anchors or hyperlinks in your document. And I'm going to distill it down to just the basics so that we can move through this material pretty quickly. The good news is that this is a great opportunity for you to get your hands dirty in writing some code. So what you should do at this point is download the code that's associated with this video. Inside of that zip file, there will be a folder called Lesson 05, and inside of Lesson 05 there's a before, a work folder, and an after folder. What I want to do is copy everything inside of the before folder, and I'm going to paste it in the work folder, and here's where I'm going to do all my work. So I'm going to open up lesson05.html in Notepad using any technique that's familiar. And if I were to just open this page up in Internet Explorer by double clicking, you can see there's just a lot of thick text with some H1 tags defining I'm at the top, or I'm at the bottom, and then anchor tags. And we're going to add some anchor tags right here, and we'll talk about this thick text a little bit later. But for now, let's do this. I want to start with a really simple scenario, and I'm going to add a link to Bing.com. And to do that, I'm going to start with just creating a paragraph, and inside of that I'm going to define an anchor tag, an opening and closing anchor tag, and inside of that I'm going to give a href attribute. I'm going to set it equal to the URL of www.bing.com. And then between the opening and closing anchor tag, I will insert any text that I want the user to be able to click on, in this case to Bing. And so let's save this and then open it up in Internet Explorer, and you can see I get a hyperlink that says to Bing beneath my anchor tag H1 here at the very top and my thick text below it. When I click on that, it opens up Bing.com in my web browser. Awesome. Alright, so what I've done here is I've defined what's called an absolute URL, where I'm including the full http://. I'm also including all the first level, second level, and third level domain name. Alright, there's also the idea of a relative URL. So in this case, let's create a reference to another page. In fact, this page will be just another.html, which is akin, I guess you would say, it is a sibling to the lesson05.html page inside of the same folder. And so to create this relative URL, I'm going to start with the opening and closing anchor tag, and then href equals, and then I'm merely going to use the name another.html. And then here inside of, or between the opening and closing anchor tag, I'll just type in another HTML page, like so. Save this. Now let's go back and refresh our page. You can see we get this link to another HTML page. When I click on that, it opens up the another.html page. It's in the same folder as my lesson05.html page, and I merely added before I recorded this video, I created that page, added the link back to this lesson05.html page, so we're able to return here using a return hyperlink. Great. There's a bit more to this story. If you take a look at this folder where I'm doing all my work, the lesson05.html page that I'm currently typing in, we've already looked at another.html. There's also a subfolder called subfolder, and inside of the subfolder there's a subfolder.html page. So what if I wanted to create a relative hyperlink from this page to the page that's inside of my subfolder? Well, to do that, let's go ahead and add another paragraph tag, and then inside that href equals, and here I'm just going to type in the word subfolder, since that's the name of my subfolder, slash then the name of the file that I want to reference, subfolder.html. And here I'm going to type to the subfolder HTML page. And let's save that And let's refresh this page. And then now let's click on our new hyperlink. And it takes us to, you'll notice, lesson05/work/subfolder/subfolder.html. Awesome. Now what if I wanted to return back from this page to the parent directory? How would I go about doing that? Well, you can see I've already created that hyperlink and it brings us back. Let's take a look at the code that I wrote to make this happen. Let's open this with Notepad, and you can see that in this case I used this special notation, .. which means go to the parent directory, at which point you'll find a file named lesson05.html. So whenever you see ... and / it means go to the parent directory to find the given resource, in this case the HTML page. All right. And we're going to come back to this notion in just a little bit. We'll talk about relative URLs and give a quick overview before we finish up. But one thing I wanted to show you is that up to this point in our page, every time I click on the To Bing hyperlink, it opens the hyperlink in the same tab in the same instance of Internet Explorer. But what if I wanted to open this up either in a new tab or in a whole new window? Well, I can accomplish that by adding an additional attribute called target. And there are a number of different target values that I could put here. The one I'm going to use though is blank, which means open up in a blank window essentially. All right. So some of the other ones have things to do with frames, and we're not going to talk about frames in this series of videos. Just note that there are some other options here besides blank. Notice the underscore before the word blank. Okay, make sure you have that. That's important. Let me refresh my web page and then click the To Bing link, and now notice that it opens up a second instance of Internet Explorer. Now that's just how I have my copy of Internet Explorer configured. You can configure it to open new URLs in new tabs in your first instance of Internet Explorer if you wish, and you would just go through, I'm not sure exactly where to do that. I think it's somewhere in Internet Options. You can configure that. I guess it's right here under tabs probably. All right, but I'm not going to take the time to look through that. All right, but that's how you would open up. And the benefit of that is that it keeps your user on your page while opening up your references to other web pages that you might have, if that's something that you want to enable. All right, finally what we want to do is talk about named anchors, and that's really the purpose of having all of this text. I needed a lot of thick text so that I can create essentially a bookmark, or I can push you deeper down into the web page using a named anchor. So let's go ahead and create a paragraph. Inside the paragraph, create an anchor tag, and inside the anchor tag I'm going to set the href equal to, and I'm going to use a pound symbol and then the word bottom, which will be the name of the anchor I'm creating. And I'm going to use this text to click on to bottom. Now what I want to do is scroll to the very bottom of this document, and where it says I'm at the bottom, I'm going to put another anchor. This time I'm not going to use an href attribute. Instead I'm going to use the name attribute, and I'm going to make sure it matches what I formerly used prior to that in the href, the pound bottom. Now I'm just going to use the word bottom with no pound symbol. So name equals bottom. I'm going to save this, and then let's open up Internet Explorer. Let's refresh this page. I have my To Bottom link, and when I click it, notice it pushes me all the way deep down to the very bottom of the web page. So you see a lot of times when you have a long article, there might be a go to the top of the web page hyperlink in the right hand corner, in which case it'll take you all the way to the top. You can enable that type of navigation. We've been using this sort of navigation all along inside of the table of contents. So for example, here I want to get to character encodings. Notice the URL in the very bottom left hand corner. There's an infrastructure.html pound character encodings, so that when I open this in a new tab, it'll bring us not only to the infrastructure.html page, but then it'll push us deep down into that web page to the named anchor character encodings to this, so that we can get specifically to this part of the page. All right, one other thing before we conclude here. Let me get back and open up our lesson05.html page that we've been working on. Notice that once you've visited a hyperlink, the default style that's applied to those hyperlinks changes the color to purple instead of blue by default. You'll have control over this in cascading style sheets. However, if you want to reset this in Internet Explorer, you'd merely go to the Tools, Internet Options. You would go to Browsing History and click the Delete button and make sure that you are deleting the history, and then click Delete, and you'll get a little message. Internet Explorer has finished deleting the browsing history. Let's go ahead and click OK, and then close down the browser so that the next time I open it up, you can see it's reset which links I've already clicked through and which ones I haven't. Again, we can control the colors of the different states of a hyperlink using cascading style sheets, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this series. All right. Okay, so when we refer to external resources in an anchor element or an image element, we need to be aware of path syntax. And we've already looked at this a little bit whenever we were looking at the subfolder a little bit ago. We've already talked about the differences between absolute and relative URLs. So this really is more about referencing relative URLs, because absolute URLs, we would just put the full domain name and all the folders until we get to the actual resource, whether that's a GIF file, an HTML page, or whatever the case might be. So if we wanted to reference something else in our href, for example, of our anchor tag, we would use, and that resource was in the same directory as our web page, we can merely reference it like so, a.gif. If that file was in a parent directory, we could use the .. notation that we talked about just a few moments ago. If the given resource is in a subdirectory called images, then we would use images/a.gif. And we saw this whenever we were referencing the subfolder, where we use subfolder/subfolder.html. Okay. But what if the images folder was, I guess, at the same level, a sibling to the current folder that we're in? So then first we need to travel to the parent directory, then travel to its subdirectory called images to find the a.gif. So that's what's represented in that ../images/a.gif. And then finally, what if the images folder was deeply nested, and so we have to go to the parent of the parent folder and then find the images subfolder where our images are stored. In that case, we could do ../images/a.gif. Okay? All right, so admittedly, this can get quite convoluted. So why not just use an absolute URL reference every single time instead of a relative URL and have to contend with all these navigating back and forth through the directory structure like we've been doing? Well, if the website should ever move, you'd simply need to keep the relative directory structure the same at the new server or location relative to the directory structure, and the same references are still valid in that case. You might think you might never need that, but if you're developing a website locally and then you move it to a server at some point, you'll quickly see the value of using relative paths over fixed or absolute paths. All right. Also, when it comes to the URL itself, some characters have special meaning or must be encoded in some way so that they're properly routed to the correct resource on the web server. This process is called URL encoding. The best and the most frequent example that you're going to see is whenever somebody has a space in a file name used in a URL. You have to convert that space character to one of two things, either a plus symbol or the %20 ASCII code. The percentage is an escape sequence to indicate that it's an ASCII value, and then the two digits that follow are hexadecimal values that indicate what kind of ASCII character. In this case, we're representing a space character with the 20. Now, there are dozens and dozens that you can find in any reference for URL encodings, but only a handful are really used frequently. So what I'd encourage you to do is just search for the term URL encoding in Bing.com, or check out the Wikipedia article that you see here on the screen for more information about URL encodings. Also, you've already seen the pound symbol used in a URL to indicate an anchor, a named anchor, deep into the body of a web page. Throughout this series, I've pointed you to specific sections on various pages in the HTML specification using the pound symbol. So I might give you a URL like this, and I'm just going to paste it in to the location bar in Internet Explorer. It includes not only the HTML file, but then also a pound symbol. And again, this allows me to deep link inside of the web page to the specific element or item that I want to call your attention to. So, but there's also a way to send name-value pairs in the URL, and that's called a query string. You're going to learn more about query strings whenever you learn ASP.NET as a means of maintaining state or passing values between two web pages. So you're going to see this type of URL often. Take a look at the URL on screen. www.whatever.com/default.aspx. Then there's a question mark, and then a val1 equal hello world, hello, and then an ampersand, and a val2 equals world. So let me explain what each of these things are doing. You can pretty much, for the most part, ignore everything up to the question mark with regards to query strings. It's everything after the question mark that is a query string. The question mark clues you into the fact that we're querying, and so everything after that is a query string. And so we have a series of name-value pairs. The name of an attribute or property is, in this case, val1, and we set it equal to some value, hello. And then to designate that we need a second set of name-value pairs, we use an ampersand symbol, and then val2 is the name of the second attribute that we have set a value to, and then equal sign to the value of world. All right. So why you might ever want to do that, again, once you get into more programming topics where you need to pass values from one web page to another, and it might be information that would be then used to look up something in a database, you'll see the value of that. But for now, just note that everything after the question mark is considered a query string, and you'll see those URLs often whenever you're looking throughout the internet. Okay, so that's all I really have to say about URLs and hyperlinks and anchors and the difference between relative and absolute URLs and so on. But this topic will come up again briefly whenever we talk about the source attribute of the image element a little bit later in this series of videos. All right, so the final element that I want to talk about is the span. So let me get back to our table of contents here, and then I'm going to hit Control F on my keyboard and type in the span element, and right click and select Open in New Tab. So it's intended to be used generically, specifying a run of text that really doesn't fit into any of the other elements that we've already mentioned. Now, the truth be told, in previous versions of HTML, you used the span element as a hook into CSS for some inline text that you wanted to format in some special way. Say, for example, you wanted some text to be red. You might wrap it with a span tag and then give it a special class or ID name in order to pluck it out and identify that little chunk of text to have a red font. That's still allowed, but you're strongly encouraged to use one of the other elements first so that the document is marked up semantically, right? So again, if you just use span elements all over the place, you use the rich semantic markup of your document that was intended with HTML5. And so you can see some uses of the span tag throughout this document, and it uses kind of a code example, and it's identifying some items as keywords for the C programming language, some items as I guess identifiers like J, and identifiers like I_T3 and so on. Okay, so that would be the use of the span in this case, where there's no other semantic markup element that would allow you to identify given elements of this code example, some as variables, some as keywords, and so on. And you can mark it up and use text coloring appropriately in that case. All right, now using the class attribute, like they use here in the as they demonstrate here in the specification, it does provide you some level of meaning to your span tags. However, since you're the one making up the values in the class attribute, other applications wouldn't be able to interpret that class attribute's value the way that they would be able to interpret HTML5 markup that's defined in the specification. The class attribute is useful for cascading style sheets, but not a screen reader, for example. The screen reader doesn't know what you mean by ident or keyword and so forth. Okay? But if you see other people's code, especially code that's written to target versions prior to HTML5, you'll see this used quite a bit, and as well as its sectioning equivalent, the div tag, and we'll have more to say about the div tag in the next lesson. Okay, finally, before we wrap up this lesson, I want to talk about the attributes that can be added to each HTML5 element. And there are a few global attributes that apply to many elements. Here in this case, I have a span tag on screen, you can see, and there is, first of all, a class attribute equal to storyline, and then an ID equal to first story header. In this case, I have two attributes, a class attribute and an ID attribute. Now, I've used a span tag, but I could have used any element here. What I'm about to show you are global attributes. They can be used on any attribute defined in HTML5. I've added a class and an ID. An ID is typically used as a unique identifier that I can add to each element if I so desire. The ID attribute is typically used for client-side scripting, for example, whenever I use JavaScript, so that I can access one item programmatically. It can also be used with cascading style sheets by referencing just the ID. So the ID attribute is completely optional, but if you do choose to use it, each ID must be unique on a given page. Similar to the ID is the name attribute, which is typically used on the server side to process form data. I'm going to discuss this a little bit in more detail when we get to the lesson on creating forms. It's similar in purpose, but typically it's utilized by our server-side code logic to retrieve a user-submitted value. Let's just table that discussion for right now. Let's talk about global attributes, and to do that, let's be in our table of contents, let's type in global attributes, because if you look at this particular web page inside the specification, it'll give you a list of global attributes that can be applied to virtually any HTML element, as well as others that have some specific uses and intent for handling events. But let's just focus on these at the very top here. The class attribute, as you can see, it's one of the global attributes that are available, is a classification of a given element. You can invent as many class values as you wish, and they're typically used by cascading style sheets as a hook for styling the elements on your web pages. Other software could utilize the class attribute for other purposes. But it's a good idea to keep class names semantically correct as well. So you might be tempted to create a class called red text, and then create cascading style sheet styles that set the appearance of the font to be red. However, a better idea might be to call it something like important message, then style it with a red font if you wish. We'll talk about CSS later, and we'll make sure to re-emphasize this idea. And there are other attributes like style and title that are global in nature, and then there's dozens of attributes that are specific to different types of HTML5 elements, and we'll cover these as needed in the rest of our lessons. Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap this up. As you probably noticed, many of the links that I used in this lesson were from this section 4.6 in our table of contents, this text level semantics. We looked at the anchor and the M and the strong and the small and the S and the cite, but we didn't look at things like the Q and the DFN and the ABR and the time and the var and the SAMP and so on. All right, so there's still a lot of work for you to do on your own. Go through each one of these and make sure you understand, or at least read through, what the semantic value is for these. So when you face a situation where you need to add some semantic markup inside of your paragraphs, you can give them the rich meaning that they deserve with HTML5. Okay? So in the next lesson, we're going to look at structural semantics. It's extremely important. Make sure you watch the next video as well. We'll see you there. Thank you.